Okay, folks, we are moving on to section 9.3. This one should be pretty easy peasy because it is something we've actually done before. But now we're going to understand this thing in the context of superclasses and subclasses. Before, what we're going to do is we're going to override methods. And we've done this before in the context of overriding our toString method and our equals method, because these methods existed in the object class. All objects have a toString method and equals method. But if you want them to behave differently other than printing the hexadecimal address or comparing hexadecimal addresses in the case of toString and dot equals respectively, then you have to override them and specify what you want to happen with those in your class that, again, is a subclass of object, right? Now, we left off with our football player project here. Kind of was a mess, actually, because putting in the new constructor and football player, that has a trickle-down effect where we then have to write constructors for all our classes. Um, I put the default one back in for the football player so that some of the stuff in main would still work. But there are probably still a lot of errors in your project. So you can do one of two things. You can um, open up the project that I posted with everything fixed, or you can try to go through and fix everything yourself. I think the second option will be much more valuable for you learning wise. But if you're just frustrated and stuck trying to get everything to work, um, you can just use mine. I'm going to quickly go through what I had to do to get everything functioning again, just to reiterate some of those ideas about constructors, because I think that constructor stuff is probably the most difficult thing to understand in this whole unit. The overriding stuff today is pretty straightforward. So with the constructors, I still have this default one, right? So we can make a default football player with no number or name. And then we have a specific one that has a name and a number. Now, anything that inherits from football player needs to use one of these two things. Okay, so if we make a defensive player constructor that uses that has actual parameters, one, it needs to call the super constructor and pass along information, and then two, it needs to do any other stuff. One of the other errors that was in my project earlier was I had accidentally put tackles equals t first, and that can't be the case. Your call to the superconstructor has to be the first line of code. Otherwise, that is a syntax error. So if you haven't fixed that one, that you should go fix that now. Now notice our defense player does not have a default constructor, and that default constructor from football player does not get inherited because constructors do not get inherited, which means our linebacker class has to have a specific constructor now that calls the superconstructor explicitly. Now our linebacker class inherits from defensive player, so when we're calling super here, that means we're calling the superconstructor of the defensive player class, which means it needs 3 parameters because the defensive player constructor requires 3 parameters. And then in our lineman class, our lineman extends football player. I've written no constructors here, which means by default it'll just make a default football player and implicitly call the football player constructor. So a lot of different examples there, a lot going on. Look at those examples from section 9.2 and look over these examples really closely to make sure you understand those ideas. All right, let's get to it. Overriding methods. That's 9.3 today. As I've mentioned, we have done this before. It is right here. You can go ahead and put this in. It's just overriding toString. You can put the override symbol here or not. It doesn't have to be there. The reason that you would put it there is to ensure that you're actually overriding something. Okay. So here's what can happen. You don't put it there, and then you accidentally put public void toString. Now you've just made another random method that you can call if you want, but it's not actually overriding anything. So in the future, if you were going to try and print a football player, this would not be called, right? So if we went in here and we did system.out.println F1 just to print out the first football player, it would still print out that default hexadecimal address because it's not going to call a void toString. That's not what the toString method is, right? It's also if you misspell something or if you went lowercase toString or something like that, those are other problems that you can come across. So that's why I like to use the at override to make sure that I'm actually overriding something. So if you put the at override in and then you make a mistake and you try and run it, it's going to give you an error and say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't actually overriding anything. This method doesn't exist. And you can see that message right there. Method does not override or implement a method from the super type. So that's a pretty clear message that you can understand. All right, so let's fix it. We're overriding string toString. So that's one example of overriding a method. This method exists in the object class. I am changing its implementation for the football player class. So let's do this one or two more times here in this project. Let's say that we're making this stuff for a football game, some sort of PlayStation console game or something like that, where you're going to be hitting a button, and that button's going to do different things depending on what player you're controlling. Does that make sense? So if I'm an offensive player like a quarterback and I hit X or A or whatever, that player's going to throw the ball. If I hit that same button, but I'm a linebacker on defense, then that linebacker is going to attempt to make a tackle. Um, for a wide receiver, maybe that button is a catching button or a boost button or something like that. I don't actually play football games, so I'm kind of talking out of my you know what here. But hopefully you understand the idea of the same button doing different things depending on what character you're controlling. This is universal to fighting games, shooting games, whatever. So I'm going to make in the football player class, I'm going to make a public void action um, method. And so this method is what's going to be called when we hit a particular button on our controller. So the A button or the X button or the triangle button or whatever. This is going to be like the button handler for that action. So let's say the generic action for a football player is just to print who the player is, right? So I'm basically going to steal the toString and say my name is name and I am number num. Okay. All right. So as soon as we have that implemented, now we should be able to call action on any of our players. Okay. Uh-oh, what'd I do? Cannot find symbol num. Oh, should be number, I suppose. Yep. My fault. Let's try it again. All right. So that football player has a name and a number. There we go. So let's say for a defensive player, though, defensive player, you hit that action button, they're going to try and make a tackle, or they are going to make a tackle. So at override And we have to make sure our header is exactly the same as the header of the pre-existing method. So public void action. If you mess up anything about this header, then you're not actually overwriting anything. Okay. All right. So what I want to do is I want to just print out uh, tackle made. And then we will, since the tackles variable is in this class, then we will increase tackles by 1. Okay. So I'm going to go back to main. I'm going to find a defensive player on which to call this. So we could pick our defensive player here that I created. You could pick a linebacker because linebackers are defensive players, whatever you want to do here. So I'm going to go defensive player 1, action. Okay, we made a tackle. There it is. So that's the basic override. Instead of printing out the person's name, which was Derek Thomas, it printed out that a tackle was made. Now, let's say you wanted to do both. You want to say, I am Derek Thomas and I made a tackle. Well, you can do that by simply calling the method in the superclass. This is a really important little tidbit here. We're going to talk more about this in the lesson 9.4, but I'm going to show it to you right now. So I could literally just copy and paste the code that I written in Football Player. I could copy and paste this, but as you all know, that's not the best idea here. We don't copy and paste code when we could simply call that code. So to call that code, we're going to go, what do you think the keyword here is? How do I call something in the superclass? The keyword is super. We saw that here. This calls the super constructor if you just use the word super. But you can also use super in the context of using dot notation. So I'm going to go super dot and then action, and then follow that up with making a tackle. So now you will see that not only did we make a tackle, but we also printed out the name and number of the player that made the tackle. All right. All right, last thing. Let's extend this to linebacker. Let's say that linebackers make tackles for a loss. A tackle for a loss is when you tackle the football player and they lose yards. So I'm going to go at over, click right action, and we're going to go super dot action as well. If we didn't do this, then our tackles wouldn't go up because the tackles variable is not in this class. The tackles variable is in the defensive player class. So I do really want to call the super dot action to make sure I increase the tackles. So, and then we will go system.print for a loss of 2 yards. So then let's see what this does, and that'll finish things up here. So we have a football player action, we have a defense football player action, and then we're going to go linebacker action. And we should include semicolons. Boop. What? So, boy, rough times. All right. Hey, here we go. So we have a football player. We have a defensive football player that made a tackle. And we have a defensive linebacker that made a tackle for a loss of 2 yards. So there it is. That is overriding methods. This is an optional thing. You don't have to override methods, right? A linebacker could just use the defensive player's method without overriding it.